it's very unstable to posit your identity on sexual experiences or drives or desires, because throughout a person's lifetime, those things will change and waver quite a lot.
Moikka! Tämä on Kujalla.podcast ja täällä keskustellaan teologiasta ja ajankohtaisista asioista. Tänään meillä on aiheena seksuaalisuus ja identiteetti. Ja vieraana minulla on pastori ja terapeutti Andy Chambers Englannista, joka on asunut täällä Suomessa jo pitkään. Ja nämä seksuaalisuuteen ja identiteettiin liittyvät kysymykset koskettavat hänen elämän tarinaansa pitkälti ja siksi hän on täällä vieraanani. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you ever so much for having me.
Great. So how are you doing today?
Well, I'm just enjoying this beautiful morning. So thank you. Yeah, great.
Great.
Great to be here.
So we're talking about identity here. So maybe it would be first a good thing to kind of describe or define what is identity? Why is it important and what does it mean?
So when we talk about identity, we're talking about something that happens inside our minds and inside our thinking processes. And we're talking about how one thinks or feels about oneself. So this is what we mean by, we could talk about how we identify something else, but we're talking about one's own identity. It's a psychological thing. How do I think and how do I feel about being me? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then there's a subset of that, which of course is gender identity, which again is how does one think and how does one feel about being a man or a woman, or in some cases what somebody else wants to identify themselves as.
Right. Well, the search for one's sexual or gender identity is kind of like at the core of our society or our culture today. And it's not always an easy journey to kind of understand yourself and find yourself, so to speak. And your own journey has not been so easy either. And a lot of times identity, of course, goes back to your childhood and those experiences. So could you share a little bit about your childhood and how those events have influenced your identity growing up?
Yes, so I had a unusual upbringing in that I grew up without both of my natural parents. So my family line is from Jamaica, and my grandfather is one of those who was invited to the UK after many. If you don't know, many Jamaicans helped the British in the Second World War. They were part of the British Empire, and as a reward for their efforts, they were invited to come to the UK. It was a famous story of a big boat called the Windrush, which the first ones came on. My grandfather was among that generation who was invited to the UK. Some years later, I think 4 years later, his eldest daughter, my mother, was invited to come as well, so she came by herself. But when she arrived, she discovered that her grandfather had in fact married another woman in the UK and had two small children living there. So she was obviously treated as some kind of outcast or whatever. And she went to another city to study nursing. And the story goes that during that time, she suffered a horrendous rape. And I was born as a result of that rape when she was just 17 years old. And so at that time in the UK, there used to be people called monitors, which were they were like a community nurse. If any of you ever see the program Call the Midwife, it will give you a sense of what London used to be like at that time. There were lots of hospitals that were Christian hospitals, as there were lots of schools that were Christian schools. And I was put into one of these Christian hospitals where I was actually born there and I later met the midwife later on. But from there, I was moved to a missionary society that were looking after orphans. My mother gave me to this children's home. It was an adoption agency, but they also had longer-term children's homes. So I grew up there. So while I was there, I had the experience of missing my father. I'd never met him. I always wondered who he was. And I did see my mother, but I saw her only 3-4 times in a year. So it was not enough to develop any relationship, and whatever bond there had been at the beginning was broken 6 weeks after I was born. So I'm very grateful for those missionaries. So they loved me and the others as best they could, but they couldn't replace my mother, and also they couldn't step in for my father because they were all female for very many years there and so on. And so I kind of grew up feeling a bit insecure and uncertain of myself, and it showed up in the early years when I went to school. There were difficulties with reading and socializing and other things like that. So I grew up feeling very insecure about myself as a person. But a little bit later, when I became a young teenager, I think I was about 13 at the time, one of the first male staff members came to the children's home. He would have been about 8 years older than me at the time. And we immediately struck up a friendship. And so he got permission to take me away for the weekends and so on. We'd often go hiking in the mountains of Wales and other places. And over time, that relationship became sexualized. And it lasted for I think about 4 years, something like that. And I think as a result of relating to him and knowing him a bit, listening to his jokes, his songs, his whole manner of life, I think he very much how could you say? I would say I had some kind of sexual awakening as a result of meeting him, but it was very much homosexual. And for me, I would say that was quite one of the major sources of confusion in my life. So not only was I insecure from not having my original father, I think, I also was confused in who I was as a boy at that time, whether I really was a boy or something like that. So I had these experiences of sort of an attraction to other men, but at the same time some kind of confusion as to whether I myself would ever become a man. So when I went into adulthood, I would describe it in two ways. I would say there was definitely a lot of insecurity about who I was as a man, and there was also confusion as to what my identity was. Just one other thing to add to that. Although the missionaries in the children's home did the best they could, there was one lady in particular who led the children's home, who was a very a broken person herself and was unable to control her emotions. And so I grew up with a lot of fear of her because she was extremely violent. So from a very young age, I was regularly beaten for all sorts of misdemeanors, or sometimes for things that I wasn't sure whether they were wrong or not. And I think that did have quite an impact on me. I can say more about that, but perhaps that gives you a kind of a picture of what sort of background I grew up with.
Well, coming out of all of that, I mean, today, I guess people would think, okay, so did you identify yourself as a gay man then, coming out of childhood, or or as you described, you were confused and you were insecure. How would you describe that?
Well, the funny thing is we get used to this terminology nowadays, but back then we didn't really have that terminology. So there was nobody around who said that they were gay. Or we didn't, and nobody that I knew of, except this particular man, spoke of homosexuality. So we just simply didn't use that terminology then. But the thing that I did know was I did know that by the time I was a teenager, I knew I was different from the other boys at school. And I knew two ways. I knew one was, so during the breaks, it was very easy for me to sit with the girls who would often sit. Boys would be more active during the recesses. And it was just very interesting for me. The other boys couldn't do that because there would be a tension between them. But for me, there was no problem to sit with them. But I felt a tension to go and sit with the boys. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I certainly didn't have in my mind the terms gay or homosexual. The first I heard that, I still remember it was way back in 1979. It was actually when there was an election in England, and I think the Conservative Party came to power. But in the run-up to that election, there was a major scandal. There were one politician in that party had a homosexual affair with another guy, and it came out in the news, and the person actually lost their position as an MP as a result of this scandal. So that was the first time I heard open discussion about homosexuality and being gay. So that was a very negative a way in which to hear it. And I remember that the other boys at school would always mock these two particular characters. Their names were Norman Scott and Jeremy Thorpe. You can easily find it from Googling it. It was a national scandal. But when they would talk about these two and mock these two, that was the first time I suddenly thought, they're talking about me. But I don't know how aware or conscious I really was of things then. But I do remember that. So as an adult, I began to feel that whatever it was that they were being accused of, I was that.
Right. So how did your story then unfold after that? I mean, you had these experiences, this relationship. Why did you end it, or how did it end, and what happened after that?
Well, something else happened. I had, when I was about 17, I had a spiritual experience. I had already left from the children's home, and I was living nearby, renting a room in a family there. There was a single mother there with 3 sons, and I was friends with her oldest son, so I rented a room there. But she used to go to a church on a Sunday. And because I'd grown up with missionaries, I was familiar with the church. So I literally went there thinking, she'll think I'm a good boy and, the rent won't go up and stuff like that. And so I went there, and it was an odd story, but back in those days, I remember the preacher was talking about, whether God had created the world or whether everything had just evolved over billions and billions of years. And the way it works in England is often the preacher will stand at the back of the church by the door at the end of the service, and he will shake hands with everybody as they go out. And when it came to my turn, he held onto my hand and asked, well, what did you think? And I just said, well, as you normally do, was a good sermon, thank you, and all the rest of it. But he held onto my hand, and he kept saying, well, yeah, but what did you think about what I said? And as far as I can remember, I just said, well, I always thought Christians believe this and other people believe that. And it was funny that you were telling me that there is disagreement or whatever. And he said, okay, he said, you must come over to my house and discuss it. And so I just sort of said yes to end the conversation. But at that time, as a teenager just left from home, I was not really thinking of going over to his house. But it so happened that on the way home from work, because I had already started working in a factory then, I had to change trains at a certain place, and by mistake, I caught the wrong train, which went quite near to where this guy lived. So I decided to go there, and I was learning piano at the time, and his wife was a piano teacher, so we made it ease there. But anyway, when he came in, he talked about this and that, and I've no idea what he said, but I do remember feeling some kind of presence in that room. I do remember that. If you're not familiar with it, it's a bit like being spooked. It's a bit like a ghost. Your hair is standing on end, and you're kind of in a tense situation, wondering what is going to happen. Except that I would say this was like spooked in reverse, because I knew two things, not with my mind. I just knew intuitively that whatever this atmosphere was in that room, that it was intelligent and that it was kind, so I began to weep, and I remember I got very, very hot, and I wasn't quite sure why. Looking back on it, I can think some healing of the heart was happening, but at the time, I remember this guy was sitting there talking about something. I don't remember what he said, but I was experiencing this warmth, this kindness, this knowledge, this wisdom. It was just there. I didn't make it there, and he didn't seem to be much aware of it either. And that continued I went back there, I think, 3 or 4 times to talk to him. I still don't remember anything of the conversations, but I do remember that there was this atmosphere each time. And so I had this experience of intermittently weeping that carried on for several months. Now, I don't remember praying any prayer of commitment or decision or anything like that, but I do remember motivation coming into me. I remember, it's funny to describe it, but if you could imagine like an airbed, like what you would use for the at the seaside or something like that, you would have a foot pump that you would pump air into it. If you could imagine somebody attaches that point to your stomach or something like that and carries on pumping until you get full, and then you're sort of saying, I can't take any more, but the person is still pumping you up high. That's how it felt. It's a funny feeling. I just felt like I was getting bigger and bigger and bigger on the inside until I couldn't contain whatever it was that was there. And I wanted to travel and see the world. And I wanted to read and to study more. I wanted to meet all kinds of people that previously I would have ignored. So there were many other things, but I felt these motives suddenly appear that previously had been more passive or apathetic about. So something like that happened. Mm. So I mean, people have asked me, they said, well, what was that? They say, well, because you grew up in England, England is full of historical Christianity. So, of course, this was you internalizing what the missionaries had taught you and what you see in the society and so on. And I think there was an element of that. I think we do that at that age as well. But nonetheless, for me, I saw in that I experienced something real that I couldn't measure with, I couldn't make a mathematical equation about it or come up with a machine to determine whether what I was or wasn't feeling. So some people might say that was at a psychological level, and certainly that was involved. But to me, that seemed to make the best sense of the historical story of Jesus that I'd read about from the missionaries from childhood. Mm. So that's what happened. Mm.
So you, as a result of all this, you then became a Christian, or what happened?
I would say I started believing or started following Jesus. Before that, I'd heard a lot about him, but I didn't really do anything about it. He became alive through those experiences to me. I could see that there was some reality there. I also had two friends who I didn't know. They were both Christians, and they told me afterwards that for them this was a success because they had been praying for me. So that sort of added to the feeling that it wasn't simply a random event, as it were. And so one of them said to me, look, I belong to this church. It's some miles away. Says, do you want to come with me? So I went with him a few times and began to get involved in a local church through that. So that's what happened. But all of that didn't, we talk a lot about the changes that it could bring. But for me, it didn't take away things from my life. It just added things in there. So I got all these new motivations and new ideas, but it didn't erase the past. The past remained as the past was.
So how did all of this kind of affect your identity as a man? How did it have some kind of impact?
Well, I would say in the beginning it didn't very much. I thought everything had changed, as probably young people obviously do when they have experiences. They think, okay, now all my problems have gone away and now I can live this great and wonderful life and God is on my side type of thing. But I would say, if anything, that experience caused me more problems than immediate solutions. I think the solutions were found in the longer term. So one thing that happened is my conscience, or my sense of morality, what is right and what is wrong, seemed to be heightened. So I suddenly thought things were wrong that I previously didn't worry too much about. And to shorten the time, when it came to, for example, my attractions to other men, I started to feel that they were wrong, whereas beforehand I hadn't really thought much about it. It wasn't that anybody preached anything in the church against it. They didn't even talk about things like that back then. It just happened. I would say it was something inside me. I suddenly began to see this was, how can I say, it wasn't even that I suddenly feel this is terrible. It was just that it was on the other side. It's that more that I just wanted more in life. And so I think it's about 6 months later, I said to this guy who was a partner at the time, I said, let's not do this anymore. And he didn't contest it. He just, I don't know, he seemed to realize what had happened, and he went on his way. And I don't know where I got the strength to do that. I remember, actually, fast forward years later, when I was getting some help for things in my life, actually the therapist, the psychologist, said to me, he said, well, somebody who'd been in your position wouldn't have been able to throw off a relationship like that so easily. So he asked me, where did you get the strength from that? So I didn't know what to say. So in the end, I just said, well, the cliche, I said, that was Jesus. Some strength had occurred that wasn't there previously. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer. But these were the sorts of things that happened. What I did do, it's kind of swings and roundabouts, because after getting rid of that particular relationship, I didn't go back. So I never took another homosexual relationship after that. But we certainly came close on a couple of occasions with some other people. But what I did do is I found pornography, and that became a kind of if you like, a way of gaining some sort of release, and it worked because it was private. Nobody knew about that, and it was accessible and available and so on. So over time, that became some kind of habit, and I would say it reached the level of addiction where it was running my life. But that was happening in private, so people couldn't see that. And I think at the same time, my faith in Jesus and the experiences that I was seemed to be being guided by, that grew. And so I took responsibility within churches. I took, youth leadership and training and all kinds of things like that, and eventually became a leader in the church. And these two things both grew at the same time. And that was disastrous. And that caused tremendous inner conflict. And a lot of people say, well, it was hypocrisy and so on. And sure, that was true. But it was another way of looking at it. I prefer the analogy of I was more like bound by it. I was more in chains to it. It wasn't really voluntary. It was something I couldn't get rid of. And it was not till many years later, actually till I think just after I had moved here to Finland. I was already 30 years old then. And I had this terrible problem. I had started to establish a church and started to lead it, but at the same time, I had a secret and hidden addiction that was there, really. And eventually, it happened that it was really interesting. There was a lady in the congregation where I was, and she always used to criticize my leadership. She was very polite. She'd say, oh, this was good and all the rest of it and so on. But then she would say, but, and then tell what she really thought about things. And that really irritated me. But eventually she said, look, I and my friends, we have been praying for you. And we heard about a conference, a week's conference, and we thought this would be really good for you. And here's the, what do you call it, the workbook, the outline book for that conference. And we got some money together, and here's enough for your plane ticket. It was in Switzerland. And we'd like to offer this to you. And so I couldn't really say no to something like that. As a pastor, I wasn't being paid very well anyway. So a free holiday to Switzerland, as I saw it, was great. So I went there, and it turned out that this particular course was a course for discipleship and healing, and it focused on relational and sexual recovery. And that was an opportunity for me, because what they did there was quite intense. So 3 times a day, somebody would speak to you on a particular aspect of that. And then 2 times in the day, we would be put into groups. So I was put in a group with 6 men. So 2 of them were leaders who'd previously experienced this, and 4 of us were newcomers. And we had an hour and a quarter twice a day to share our responses and reactions to the teaching. And so I remember in that situation, I remember the group leader saying, this is an opportunity for you to confess your own sins. And because this is an area of sexuality, he said, you won't have these opportunities very many times in your life. So I remember he said, so don't say something small, say something big. That's what he said. And of course I had been a pastor, so I was ready to let other people go first. But eventually it came to my opportunity to do it. And I remember the experience, feeling like I closed my eyes. Of course, there's no reason to do that, but I did it anyway, and put my head down. And I started to share what I had pre-planned to share, some incidents. But then as I did that, I felt the same kind of experience I'd felt much earlier. This sense you get very, very hot. I felt that there was this love there and this intelligent spirit there. And so I shared many more things than I had planned to share. And then when I came to the end of what was in my mind then, I remember he put his thumb under my chin, and then I could feel the tension in my body of trying to keep my head down and him trying to push it up and so on. And he just said, he gave a deep sigh and said, "Oh, at last you're coming out of shame." And I realized that the secrecy and the hiding of the area of my life that I felt ashamed of had caused a lot of stress and a lot of tension within me. So for me, that was a significant moment when I actually began to be a bit more honest about what had actually happened in my life. So that didn't necessarily take away desire for same-sex intercourse or interaction. Didn't take away it, but I myself began to somehow acknowledge that for some reason this had been a part in my life, and that I needed to be more honest and accurate in talking about it. But in doing that, I also gained a certain amount of strength. So I also somehow, I mean, this all happened over a period of time. It wasn't just that week. It became a practice in my life. And I began to strengthen in who I was as a man, and to take responsibility, not only for the decisions that I do make in my life, but also take responsibility for the things that had happened to me, the damages that other people had done, the man I mentioned and the woman in the children's home and many others. They were not my fault, but nonetheless, they were part of my life. I needed to take responsibility for how I react and respond to these things that happen. So it was a long journey.
Yeah. So nothing happened, suddenly, okay, now I have become a Christian like this, and all my problems or all my issues have vanished, but rather that it was a long process of
over time.
Over time. And you had gotten married to a woman.
Yes.
So how was that? I mean, was that like, because you had a homosexual relationship before, you still got married to a woman? How did that happen?
Well, I didn't tell her. So I was way too ashamed of it at that time. I think we were already married 6 or 7 years, and we were struggling in many different areas. And we went to, fortunately here in Finland, there in the summertime, various organizations offer these marriage camps or whatever. And we went to one of those. And they also had a time when it was possible to share what you're feeling, where there's 3 other couples together with you in a group, and you just share what the issues are, and you get peer group support. And I chosen before I went there, now is a good moment to do this. And so I shared. It wasn't the first time, it was the second time that I had shared with her, my wife, and then she began to interact with it. The first time I shared with her was after that experience coming back from Switzerland, but she was not interested at all. She was only interested in the fact that I had not brought her a present back from Switzerland, and so it didn't mean anything to her then. But about 6 or 7 years later, then it did mean something, and she kind of understood. A lot of people think, does that mean that you didn't have sex or the sex went badly or something like that? It wasn't that at all, actually. She was more concerned about other things, like I didn't speak up for myself when we were having an argument. So she said that I let her win too easily. Or she would say, well, you don't take initiative in things like, what do we need to do next with our finances, or you don't clean the house on a regular schedule or something. So very many normal things she saw, I guess I would say, weaknesses in who I was as a man. That was more her complaint. And so there were many things like that where I saw, yes, I have not had a father, I've not grown up with other men, so I don't necessarily know how to do things that traditionally people expect men to do, or don't do them instinctively. And so I had to learn to do them.
Well,
but I just want to say about that, that's one important part, because a lot of people who grow up with same-sex attraction and act on it and end up in homosexual relationships, often they have developed the characteristics that we traditionally think of as belonging to the opposite gender. And I usually say to people like that, well, those things are very, very good. But you need to make a choice in your life to develop skills and behaviors that are really going to be appropriate to the role you're going to have in life. So whilst I believe that men and women can do, a variety of different things and largely the same things, on average, men will do more and better at certain things and women are better equipped for other things. And I just say, well, whatever you've developed, keep that, but make choices over what you develop so that they can be more appropriate to your role. And for me, the best example of it, I remember when I was at school, I chose things like, some people get upset by this, but I chose things like cooking classes, and I did a lot of needlework that back then were traditionally thought of a thing that women would do. And a lot of that, I decided later on in life that the cooking I would keep, because that's very useful to our family, or my wife likes it. But the needlework and things like that, I decided I didn't need it. There were other things I needed to develop. And I think, again, it's part of this taking responsibility for how you have reacted, how you have developed, and then choosing according to what you want to become.
Right. Well, it's interesting in your story that, okay, you had this homosexual relationship when you were a young boy, but still you got married to a woman. So it sounds like that sexual identity thing that we think today, commonly speaking, that it's a fixed thing, that you're either gay or bi or straight, or you're, cisgender or, transgender or whatever. So you also work as a therapist with people, and one of the areas or that you discuss and help people with is, of course, the area of sexuality. So what is your view? Like, is the human sexuality then fixed, as we kind of seem to think today, that you are either 100% straight or you're either 100% gay? Because your story kind of seems like it's more fluid than that.
Well, what I've seen in people that I meet, and that's, of course, a small sample of the whole population, in short, it's fluid, and it's affected, I would say, to a degree by our biology, but it's also affected to a degree by our experiences, our environment as well. These two both play a part in... And there are so many things that affect it. Example, who you are attracted to depends on who you meet. You're not attracted to everybody, but it just depends on who you meet and who you don't meet. And I think there are other things as well. So as a teenager, I went to a lot of parties and discos and so on, and people took alcohol and drugs and so on. And in that environment, you see people act in all sorts of ways that in their right mind, they would say they don't act this way, and they wouldn't attribute that to being their identity or whatever. But nonetheless, the actions were taken. So you also find that in restricted environments like prisons, children's homes, other places like that, people will often act in ways that they wouldn't act in a broader population, and so on. So I would say human sexuality is malleable. It is changeable. It will generally flow in a certain direction, but in certain environments and with certain experiences, it will. One issue that illustrates it for me was, I remember getting a beating as a child from the woman in the children's home that I mentioned. It was beating with a stick, and she had lost control. And I remember she was going further than just beating my legs. She was beating my heart. And I believe that incident planted a seed of hatred and bitterness in my heart towards her. But because she was older and dominant, the opposite happened. So I would act kind and nice towards her. And I learned how to control her moods. So I learned it rather unconsciously. And maybe that's what made it easier for me to talk with the girls in the playground at school. I'd learned how to control things. But underneath that was this deep resentment and hatred that was there. And I remember later when I saw other women who were like her, even if I didn't know them, they just looked like her, I would have the same visceral reaction of bitterness and hatred towards them. And by the time I became an adult, it had generalized so that all women I suspected of something violent or something controlling without even thinking. This was unconsciously there. And that was, if you like, the root or the seed of bitterness that had been sown much earlier in my life. So part of being attracted to other men was actually being walled off towards other women. I don't say it's the same for everybody, but there are other people like me out there who may think of themselves as being something, but a review of their history would tell you, well, there are incidents and experiences that have caused you to react and respond in certain ways. Mm. Yeah.
So do you think it would be somehow helpful for people to maybe understand the fluidity of all this better? Because it seems like in today's society, maybe everything is so black and white that you know, okay, you are either in this LGBTQ camp or you're, you know, in the cis straight camp and that's it. Or what do you think?
Well, as a person, I tend to believe that people should be free to do whatever they want once they're adults. And it's just like when you go to a doctor, you know, you have the problem solved that you want solving, but the doctor doesn't tell you everything that he discovers. Otherwise, no one would be able to live. And I think the fact that we have our sexuality and it goes the way it is, I don't think it's my place to go around and tell everybody, well, look, the reason why you feel like this is because of, you know, these 10 years of incidents that have happened in the past. People are free to do whatever they want. But I think the statistics show us that children seem to need both male and female parents. And it's not to say that it can't be done otherwise, or there aren't exceptions, or that people who are in other types of relationships are not doing well. But overwhelmingly, it seems, if we look at school education or higher education, those who come from stable families where there are two parents involved, they usually succeed far better than others do. And I remember one lady, I think Sarah Keenan, did research on the men's prison in Vasa, and it was discovered there that 75% of the inmates at a certain time had no meaningful relationship with their father. And so for me, I think it's very important that we acknowledge this, not that it's the only type of family expression that can be there, but this is the one that seems to have produced the best results down the century and still seems to today. And that's going to have a huge effect on human sexuality. If we want that kind of thing to happen, then obviously we want people who grow up with a healthy attraction to the opposite sex. Mm.
Well,
I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah. Yeah, that was good. Well, when it comes to sexuality in our society, we kind of seem to think that whatever you kind of are feeling is basically then the way forward. That is the route that you should pursue and have those types of relationships as long as, you know, the other party involved is consenting. What do you think about that? It's very like it focuses very much on how one is feeling at a maybe certain time.
Yeah, I mean, again, I can't say how society should act. I can say for me that I chose not to do that. And I believe that people can choose not to do it. I don't think people should be forced to choose one way or the other. But for me, the same-sex attraction did not disappear and has not disappeared. But the life that I want to live, I wanted to get married and I wanted to have children. And I think most people do. So I think we should encourage that. It's good for society. The birth rate in Finland is 1.4. It needs to be 2.1 if the population is to keep on replacing itself. The last 9 years, traditional Finns, the proportion of traditional Finns living in Finland has dropped because of the low birth rate and the higher birth rate of immigration. And that's a concern, I would say. I would say that we would want to replace the natural population, if not grow it. And the best way to do that, as far as I can see, is to encourage heterosexual family relationships. So I think there's nothing wrong with society saying, well, look, this is the ideal and this is what we want. But we also accept that many people will not choose that and they choose to live a different way. I think that's fine. I don't have anything against it. I think more the question for me is as those spiritual experiences did in fact give me the picture that the way of following Christ was the way that I chose to go, and I would recommend it for others, but it can't be forced. A person must see that themselves. However, when it comes to young people, to those who are under 18, I think we have to be careful because they don't have that adult processing power to decide where their decisions are going to take them and what is going to happen. And the one thing I would say is that I think for a person's emotions and for their mental well-being, it is good for children under 18 to be taught that human sexuality is extraordinarily powerful, and if you act on it physically before you have some kind of covenantal or contractual relationship with the other partner, then the chances of you hurting yourself emotionally and mentally are very, very high. And that goes for whether the person is heterosexual or whether they are homosexual or whether they feel they are transgender. If you act on your human sexuality without there being some kind of long-term covenantal relationship, the chances of, we use the word heartbreak, but severe emotional and mental trauma is very, very high. So I don't think that's good for society. So I think we should give people the choice, but I think we should be clear on what we encourage.
Mm-hmm. So you're a Christian, and yes. The question of identity in our society, I guess the sexual identity is such great, or we have emphasized it quite a lot. So what is your, do you think for you, is it the Christian identity or your sexual identity? Which one is kind of more foundational for you?
Well, I mean, for me, after having those spiritual experiences that began as from a teenage year and have continued, I would say I now identify as a child of God. It sounds like a cliche, but I think that spirit or that power that I experienced, the best explanation to me is that comes from the Christian God, and it wasn't outside of me, it got into me. And so I would say at core, that would be a better identity to live by. I would say it's very unstable to posit your identity on sexual experiences or drives or desires, because throughout a person's lifetime, those things will change and waver quite a lot. Even medical processes can affect it. There are all sorts of things that might affect somebody's sexuality. So I wouldn't posit your whole identity on it. It is a very important and very powerful part of a person's life. And outwardly, one can see it. It will affect the way a person dresses, the way they present themselves. It will affect all sorts of things that a person can see from the outside. But I think I wouldn't base my identity on that. I would say, you know, I've had various sexual experiences and various drives and emotions and various thoughts about who I am. But I would say that was simply a process of understanding that changed over time. But the thing that does seem to have been concrete for me is when I began to accept that there was some power, some invisible, unseen spirit outside of myself that gives definition to who I am. And so that's what I read when I looked into the Bible. I see an outside power there saying who men and women are. And when I had my own spiritual experiences, it was the same thing. There's someone else telling me who I am, that I have been made male, that I've been made a man, and that reflects something about who God is and that God loves me the way I am. And that gives me a real basis for beginning to accept myself. And I see this a lot when I meet with people who are transgender. There may be all sorts of things that we're yet to learn about this, but one of the things that I commonly see is that there is this lack of acceptance of who they are. So they may say, well, I am this or I am that. Whichever they are, you got to learn to accept it. And it seems to me that if you choose yourself, who you are, you have no reference point other than yourself for what reality is. So I have chosen to accept a reference point outside of myself, and that has been the historical God of the Bible, but updated by my own spiritual experiences.
Well, there are Christians who, you know, struggle with these issues and wonder how should I live my life? I have, homosexual feelings, or I might not feel like fully a woman or fully a man or whatever. What would you say to someone who's a Christian and takes their maybe Christian faith seriously, but then at the same time have many questions about their sexual identity?
Well, I think if a person takes their Christian faith seriously, then that to me would usually mean that they would accept what the Bible says about human sexuality. And in that sense, it's plain from the first chapter that God made men and women in his image, and he made them male and female. So it is God who has done that, whether we like it or whether we feel like it, or whether current philosophies and ideologies agree with it. A serious Christian would accept, well, at least this is what God has said he has made. But I would say we should also understand the Bible certainly talks about men and women falling into sin, and then the whole creation being affected by that. So it's a bit like you have to look at the whole world through two sets of glasses. One set of glasses tells you what was originally made, but another set of glasses tells you, well, how does it look now that it has been distorted, now that it has fallen. So I think human sexuality, along with everything else in the environment, was originally created by God and can still be seen what God intended. But it is fallen and it is distorted, and that distortion has gone down the generations. So it may, it's in your genes and it's been inherited from things that have gone on with our forefathers. So yes, people are going to be born who will not be able to, or will not be wanting to even have the kind of relationship that the Bible teaches, which is a heterosexual relationship. So there is an alternative given, which is very unpopular today. Of course, the alternative is that you don't enter into a marriage relationship, which would mean that you don't express your sexuality in a physical way. Now, of course, we live in a culture that is highly sexualized. So the idea of telling certainly a young person that might be a way for you is almost laughable. But nonetheless, we're talking about a person who seriously wants to follow Christ, who himself did not engage in a sexual experience or marry. And the other person who taught this subject about marriage was Paul, who arguably founded the whole movement. He himself, as far as we know, did not marry or engage in a sexual experience. There are those who say he may well have been a widower, but at least what's recorded, we have two single men talking about human sexuality, which would be, in today's world, almost next to impossible. So I would say that's what the Bible says, that you can either have a traditional family in the sense that's written there, or you can abstain from sexual relationships. So for a lot of people, that is going to cause a great deal of suffering. I meet people continually, often it's more women than men, but continually women who are not married and would like to marry, but they haven't found somebody. But I meet a greater number of people who are married who wish that they weren't, because they have significant difficulties with their partners. And as you know, in Finland, I think it's about 48% of all marriages end in divorce. So it's almost half of them. So I think the Christian way to that is twofold. One is that we've lost today. The Christian life is actually a life of suffering. So we forget it, but at the heart of Christianity, Jesus didn't come to heal the sick or to save those who are depressed or broken. He did those things, but that wasn't why he came. He came to die. He actually came to make his own life a sacrifice for our sins. Now, we don't do that. He has done that for us, but he does call us to follow him. He even said on occasion, he said that if you want to follow me, that perhaps is your word seriously, he says you have to take up your cross. Now, today that would be, it's a cliche. Well, that was an extremely offensive thing to say somebody has to take up their cross. That means you have to walk towards your death, carrying your own executioner on your back. And I think we've forgotten that aspect of Christianity, that to follow Jesus is actually a way of suffering. He said that anybody who wants to come after me has to deny themselves. It's interesting he uses that word self that is so much argued about today. He says they have to deny it. So he's the one who defines us. He's the one who decides who we are and how we go. It isn't given to human beings to make up those definitions for ourselves. The second thing I would say is that he has sent us his Spirit. I now know, looking back, that those spiritual experiences I have, the Bible calls the Spirit a comforter or a healer. So not only do we have to deny ourselves and walk the way of the cross in obedience to what we believe Christ is saying to us, he doesn't just leave us like that. But to those who do that, there is comfort, there is compensation. There are things that God will do in the life of a believer who follows him. And that will be different for everybody. So some people may think, well, he can't replace their sexuality or their life of a marriage or whatever it is that their ideal was. We may think, well, God can't replace it. Yes, he can. He doesn't necessarily change the situation for you as it is. He might do that. He doesn't necessarily do that. But there are other things in your life that he will do, that let you know that he loves you and he's there for you, and there is a meaning to the life that you are living. And I think we have to learn, once again, how to truly serve our partners or our friends or people around us, to learn to love other people and to have a little bit less focus on myself and what I need and what I want. Now, I'm saying that as an older person now. I realize that as a young person, people don't think like that. But just underlining this word, if you seriously want to follow the Lord, then you need to take stock of the fact that this is going to cause a lot of suffering, whether you are single, whether you're married, whether you're heterosexual, homosexual, or transgender. It is going to cost you if you decide to live God's way in God's world rather than your way in your world.
Right. Well, that's interesting and definitely very countercultural today. Well, your final words. Many Christians have these conversations with friends who maybe are from the LGBTQ community, and they can find those conversations very difficult because of traditional Christian views are so different from the views of, or the popular views of the LGBTQ community. So what are your key recommendations or thoughts? How can we as Christians love our neighbors and have kind of wise conversations with them?
Well, the first thing is listen. So I think my experience has been that as Christians, it's easy to think that we know the answer. And human beings are exceedingly complicated, and we've been around for a long time, and we have a wide variety of experiences. And so when you're talking to somebody who has different views from you, my suggestion is you listen. And by listening, I mean asking questions that help them to share their experience and their views more, rather than having the feeling that I need to share my view with you. Because I think it's just it's a social skill, isn't it? And we often forget to do that, especially with these very emotive issues. And also, of course, we want things to change in society for better as we see it. And so it's easy to sort of become some sort of warrior who's out there trying to hold up a flag for our view of the family and for our view of the Bible or whatever. And I would say we need to learn to drop that and actually listen to what people are saying. Usually I've found that when you listen to people and ask the right questions for long enough, people tend to trust you. And once they trust, that leads to a certain vulnerability and so on. The process goes forward from there. But it all starts with being willing to listen to the other person rather than feeling the need to share your views with them. So I would say that's the first thing to do. But I would say the second thing is to do what I call seed drop. And that is to plant seeds in people's minds that it's possible to change. So Christianity stands on the idea that the individual can be converted. It was radical in the ancient world. In the ancient world, the father of the household decided everything. You couldn't choose your own religion or where you went or whatever. But when Jesus came on the scene, he said, anyone who believes, whether you're a woman, whether you're a man, whether you're a slave, whether you're free. So he put individual choice to people. And I think we can seed drip in a conversation by simply asking people, well, what do you want? And if a person says, well, I want to continue with the lifestyle that they continue with, then we have to endorse that and allow the person to go on with what they're doing, because that's what they want. That's their free choice. But there will be those who will say, well, I wish it wasn't like this, or they remember the pains that they went through when they were younger with this, and hope that there's an alternative out there. And then when that moment comes, then we need to be lined up and ready with friends or books or websites where we've heard that people have changed. And most importantly, we need to be lined up with our own experience. So we may not have the same problem, that the person we're talking to has a problem. But if you are serious about being a Christian, there will be an area in your life where you know that you have sinned and you have done what is wrong. Or you will have other areas where somebody severely damaged you and you know that it hurts. So beginning to share those experiences with people who have different points of view with you, you will find that they have common experiences. So unity comes in our humanity, not in our aspirations. So our vision of what we should be or who we can be, we'll all have different views on that. But our humanity, the fact that we do things that we don't want to do and that other people do things to us that damage us, that is universal. So we have those problems the same as other people have those problems. So sharing your own experience of how did you overcome lying? How did you overcome smoking, swearing, all kinds of things like that, or other habits that you may have, how you deal with it, all of that is dropping seeds into the life of another person, that it's possible to change something.
Right. And I guess Christ came here to change us, to save us
Absolutely.
From sin. So we're not meant to stay the same when we start following Jesus.
Yeah, we live in a society that wants to outlaw the whole idea of conversion, even though nowadays they try to call it conversion therapy. But just to reiterate the point, Christianity is all about conversion. It's all about change. It's all about transformation. And sexuality is included in that. If you want to follow Jesus, then you have to get ready for change.
Right. Well, thank you, Andy, for this interview.
Welcome.
Great that you came. Kiitos myös teille kaikille katselijoille, ja kun olitte mukana, ja palautetta tästä jaksosta voi lähettää osoitteeseen kujalla.podcast@gmail.com. Ja jos haluat tukea tämän podcastin tekemistä, niin olemme kiitollisia kaikista tukijoista. Tämä vie tietenkin paljon resursseja ja aikaa ja vaivaa useammalta ihmiseltä saada tämä aikaiseksi. Eli tukea voi osoitteessa patreon.com/kujalla. Kiitos kaikille ja mukavaa viikon jatkoa, ja ensi kerralla nähdään. Moi moi!